Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban bikum. Welcome once again to the Sulaiman Ravat show, that time of the week. Yeah, depending whether you're watching the program on a Friday night or on a Sunday morning or on a Wednesday afternoon. Those are the three time slots within which this program features. Well, whether it's a relaxed Friday evening after a long week, or whether it's an early Sunday morning, maybe you've just had some exercise, or you've had your early breakfast or brunch, or whether it's a Wednesday afternoon and you're just chilling at home, or you're busy in the office, whatever the case may be, welcome to the program. Another opportunity for us to discuss, to analyze, to unpack, to engage. There's just so much to talk about. There's just so much to focus on. I'm not even talking about in the global context, or even in the social context, or even in the religious context. I'm talking here about politically in South Africa. Ever so often, we have Angelo Fig join us on the line. He is with ASRI, and we have a chat around some of the issues that are the talking points, some of the hot political developments in our country, and we do the same today. Angelo, assalamu alaikum. Welcome once again to the program.
Alaikum assalam to you and to your viewers.
I don't know where to start. I mean, the list is just so long, but let me ask you this. With your many years of experience, this kind of period that we're going through in South Africa, is there a word that just kind of instantly pops up in your mind to describe this period?
Difficult, chaotic, hard, and for some people, possibly the hardest thing we've had to go through. And then we have older people who look at us and go, "This is not hard. This is just standard." So it's difficult times for many of us, and on all the fronts that you've outlined at the beginning. That is often so tainted by the political, and that, I think, is what makes this very difficult rather than just interesting times.
Let's start with the story that has a bit of an international aspect to it. The whole UK vaccine saga. What's your take? Is this the UK punishing us because we didn't take AstraZeneca? Is there basis? Is there justification for them being so strict on South Africa and then making exemptions for others like Kenya? On the face of it, to us as South African citizens, doesn't seem to make much sense.
So I think often in South Africa, we have this imagination that our politics is riven with chaos and poor decision-making, and somebody else's politics is based on rationality and good sense. And for a while now, the United Kingdom's politics has been driven by very irrational forces and very strange internal dynamics. And so part of what has happened with South Africa is that the internal politics of the United Kingdom, the domestic issues inside Great Britain, between the Conservative Party and government and its various constituencies that have put it there, has possibly accounted for some of what goes on in their international relations. We've seen this with the very strange behavior of their foreign secretary, former foreign secretary Dominic Raab, the cabinet reshuffle that their Prime Minister Boris Johnson has instituted, and the kind of chaos around their international trade deals that has France and the European Union up in arms. So what we're likely to see is that in South Africa, we've just seen that the decisions that we think should be rational around how other states treat us reflect the irrationality of their domestic politics, just like our domestic politics often affect the irrationality of our international relations, not just the domestic governance issues.
Now, the issue of reciprocity, right? I've seen this comment being made that, well, if this is what they're going to do to us, then we must return the favor. Some years ago, I mean, the United Kingdom took the decision that South Africans could no longer come without applying for a visa in advance. There was no longer visa on arrival. And we were not in a position to reciprocate. That's just a political reality. Would the same apply here?
So I think the international imbalance of power affects the ways in which South African and other global South countries can and cannot respond. So that's been part of the issue around our relationship with the United Kingdom ever since 1994 as a democratic society. And what I think is shifting in the world is that a country like the United Kingdom is doing all sorts of internal reorganizations, changes as if they were still a global empire. And since their separation from the European Union, in all sorts of ways, they've been shown up to be very, very weak in terms of international relations. They are currently trying to align themselves with the United States in a new way from their old traditional friendship or special relationship, as it was called in the Tony Blair years. But we must remember that we're living in a multipolar world in terms of other countries' abilities to negotiate, other stronger countries. So the Chinese relationship with the Taliban in Afghanistan, for example, is an indication of where the multipolar world's power shifts are happening. We've seen this earlier with the Russian relationship with Syria, and with the Turkish relationship elsewhere. So we're likely to see a very different kind of distribution of power now that the United Kingdom is outside of the European Union. Internally to the United Kingdom, there are concerns around food and other product shortages, inflation. They've just had to introduce a new national a national insurance tax that has really very many people on the margins of their society very concerned about how they're going to survive. And so when we look to the relationships between states, we often take into account those global inequities between the wealthy North and the traditionally poor South. But that itself is shifting, as we saw with vaccination, as countries started negotiating independently with Russia and with China and with India for vaccination issues, particularly coming from South American states. And increasingly in economics, we're going to see that shift happening. And the United Kingdom weakened itself, and most observers have indicated this is what would happen in their post-Brexit years. And so this may look very, sort of a power move by the United Kingdom. But my sense is that this has to do with all sorts of strange dynamics inside the UK, including this attempt to return to the imperial system away from the metric system. It's narrow jingoism that probably won't play out well in the longer term, because we know that there are many people in the United Kingdom who have very strong property relations and commercial relations with South Africa. And there are also familial and other kinds of relations where people will feel the need to travel, and they may put pressure on the Conservative Party to change their policy.
All right, let's talk Constitutional Court now, right? There's two developments, I suppose, that we can focus on this week. Let's take the Zuma one first. Much has been made about the wording in the judgment. Let's talk about the judgment, and then we can get to Zuma's letter after that.
Right. So the Constitutional Court, in their response to the rescission application, generally, I think they were very clear that there cannot be, the majority at least, was very clear that you cannot continue to operate in parallel to the legal system as it is established for the majority of people in this country. And that, I think, is a very, very important statement to put down, because challenges to the Constitutional Court have to happen inside the constitutional framework. And the kind of appeal to the minority judgment to justify critique of the court is to misunderstand how judicial judgments work. The minority opinion will certainly affect future legal cases, but it's the majority judgment that actually stands in relation to the appeal or matter that is before it. And there, I think, the court was very clear in the wording of the judgment that it did not take the challenges lightly, and that it didn't take the task lightly, but that it also didn't appreciate the manner in which this was dealt with before it. The two phrases that sprung to mind were, one of them was certainly litigious. I've not forgotten the second one because I'm trying to focus on the answer to the question. But there were really, in the phrasing that Justice Kampepe read out, it was very clear that the court had really its patience had been tested, and it was beyond where it needed to be or wanted to be.
This whole talk about taking it to what I think is called the Africa Court. Give us the background there. What court is this? What jurisdiction would it have over the Constitutional Court in South Africa? Is this now more of a political move than a legal move by the Zuma camp?
Right. So the African Court was established because there were concerns around the ICCs dealing with matters very inequitably when it came to people in states in Africa. And this then led to the establishment of this court as a continental body to which all sorts of human rights violations and other concerns could be taken. The concern that several observers and legal scholars have raised around the appeal by the Zuma lawyers to the African court was that it hadn't been domesticated into South African law, and South Africa's membership of that court was very conditional on all sorts of things, and that the African court also, does not intervene where the local courts are quite capable, just like the ICC does not intervene unless requested by the state, and where local law enforcement and prosecutorial authorities can't proceed. The difference between the ICC and the African Court in South Africa at the moment is that the ICC protocols, the Rome statutes, were in fact domesticated by an act of parliament, whereas the way in which South Africa signed up to the African Court hasn't yet gone through the parliamentary process, and therefore this appeal seems quite, it's not even political so much as rhetorical. It is not that international law supersedes domestic law. That has never been the case. The relationship between domestic and international law has to go through the legislature, because in a democratic society, the people's representatives decide what law governs the society on behalf of the people who elected them. And so this hierarchizing, which is, I suppose, commonsensical, logical to many observers, is actually not jurisprudentially logical, because this is a society in which, until that international law or that treaty is domesticated by an act of parliament passed through the people's representative in the National Assembly and signed off by the executive, it actually is just, it exists as a set of principles that sometimes guide case law and prosecutions and other forms of civil litigation in the domestic space in South Africa. But it isn't some kind of supernumerary law that somehow disintegrates or puts aside domestic law. That is not how international law works. And Philippe Sands, the scholar of international law, has written extensively on the ways in which international law can be used and the misunderstandings people often have, that it is somehow a higher law than the domestic law of a country. And that's not the case.
Now, Zuma's letter, and I suppose the key point that comes to the fore there is he talks about South Africa moving from a constitutional democracy to a constitutional dictatorship. It would seem like he's regurgitating the same kind of arguments that he made before. He was sent to the escort prison. Even from a political perspective, does this kind of letter writing by the former president have any political effect or impact?
Well, I suppose his supporters and those who think that there is justice in his cause will take this letter, regardless of any evidence to the contrary of its factuality. To begin with the phrase constitutional dictatorship, one wants to ask, what does that mean? Because this is not a judicial dictatorship, which is what we were earlier told by other supporters around the relationship between courts, the executive, and the legislature. The separation of powers in South Africa is such that those three are supposed to balance themselves out, and when they don't, it is really the fault of the oversight authorities in each of those sectors that don't help. In this case, one wants to ask, is the dictatorship supposedly instituted by the foundational law of the country, or do they mean it's by the constitutional court's interpretation of that law? Because if their issue is with constitutional interpretation by the courts, then it's not constitutional dictatorship that they're referring to, but perhaps judicial dictatorship, because it's the judges who are not giving them what they want. The Constitution, after all, is the foundational law. It is the supreme law. It supersedes all others. And we have to, as a society, and as members of this society, conduct ourselves inside the dictates of the Constitution. The Bill of Rights is very clear on this. The preamble to the Constitution is very clear of this, and all the precepts in the Constitution very clearly indicate that we're all, including presidents or former presidents, are functions of the Constitution in our public conduct with the state, but also in our conduct with one another as citizens and or people who live in South Africa. And so it is ironic that this phrasing is used, because it implies that somehow there is something wrong with obeying the foundational law of the country. And that is certainly not the constitutional order that we live in. The constitutional order we live in says this is the supreme law, and all conduct in the country must adhere to it and work within the parameters set by it. And therefore, we have, since 1996, lived in a constitutional dictatorship because the Constitution dictates how we behave and how our institutions behave with us. And that, I think, is part of the flaw here, that Mr. Zuma seems to take legal advice and statements come out of his supporters that support their view of the world, but is actually often at odds with the factual construction and the administration of the world that Mr. Zuma once took an oath, in fact, twice took an oath to defend. And so the ironies are multiple, and it's beginning to slide into tragedy, the kind of basic errors of logic and understanding that seem to be emanating from these kind of statements that are put out in order to justify the unjustifiable.
We know that the Zuma medical parole is also a legal issue, and the DA is on its way to challenging that. Arthur Fraser has come out explaining why he thinks he had the authority to overrule the medical parole board. Then you've had President Ramaphosa welcoming the decision, but then later on saying that he was not consulted. The decision was taken by Arthur Fraser on his own. Then the NPA coming back saying their doctors say that Zuma's ready to stand trial. Do you think that this medical parole and his medical condition is now going to become the next red herring, if you like, or the next excuse that Camp Zuma will use to try and evade the long arm of the law?
It is possible that they will attempt to do this. Let's not forget that the arguments put before various courts by figures like Dali and Mpofu have, asked us to indulge Mr. Zuma based on his age, based on his health. But there are very fundamental precepts in the Bill of Rights of the Constitution that argue for equality and argue against unfair discrimination based on things like age. And that needs to be taken into account. To take administrative justice seriously, there also has to be equality of application. And people have already found other elderly, people who are imprisoned, who should be on leave and therefore and are not. If it comes to it, my position is that this does not necessarily have to be a custodial sentence. It didn't have to be. In terms of age, it could have been, taken and put under house arrest. But then that should be equally applied to the many thousands of other prisoners who are sitting in our facilities, and particularly those who have had ill health. There have been spectacular cases in the public space where people have been denied parole by the Minister of Justice, even as they pleaded medical reasons for such parole, and indicated very clearly that they were of a certain age. So we need to be very clear that if we can't stand by the rights of our political opponents, or by those from whom we differ politically, and apply the rights we would like and the conditions we would like for ourselves to others, it becomes rather a hollow cry in a democracy when you want those to apply to you. The second issue, of course, is whether or not Mr. Zuma's claims will be dealt with by the courts on the basis of merit, or whether people are going to judge the court's judgment on the basis of sentiment. And here again, it has to do with merit, because you have to have administrative equality rather than sentiment, because once you start making these decisions based on who someone is, the sentimental feelings you may have about them, you have inequality in a state that is already unequal. And really, we're trying very hard to not only undo the inequalities of the past and those consequences, but we have to work very actively not to have new forms of inequality. And then at the heart of this Arthur Fraser matter is the very policy that the president of the country defended at the Zondo Commission of Inquiry into State Capture, which is cadre deployment. This is the face of cadre deployment. This is what happens when you have party appointees and political appointees in key positions who can then suspend the rules. And those of us who've worked in South African organizations know this all too well. I mean, I once was a member of a research committee at a university, and the head of the committee said, know the rules and know 5 ways around the rules to get your way. And that seems to be how so much of what has gone wrong in South Africa over the last 27 years, despite our best attempts, is structured. There are rules, and then there are ways around the rules, which have to do with often the letter of the rules rather than the spirit of the rules. So instead of changing the letter in order to match the spirit of equality and justice and administrative equity for everybody, we simply rely on, well, we're the ones in power. I'm allowed to make this decision. I don't have to justify this decision. The administrative power lies with me. And that, I think, speaks to what is so wrong at the heart of so much corruptibility in South Africa.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we continue the discussion with Angelo Fick. Welcome back. So we're talking about recent happenings and the big stories in terms of the politics of the country with ASRI's Angelo Fick. Prior to the break, we spoke about the UK vaccine issue. We spoke about the Constitutional Court ruling in terms of President Jacob Zuma's rescission application, his subsequent letter, and the whole story about the Africa Court, and then also his medical parole. Staying with the Constitutional Court, Angelo, the DA seemed quite confident that the court would rule in their favor, that the IEC was wrong to reopen the process for the list of candidates to be submitted, which obviously helps the ANC a hell of a lot. The court this time ruling against the DA. Your thoughts on that?
So my sense of looking at the timetable of the IEC before all of the changes was that there would always be an opportunity, and has always been an opportunity, for candidates to be registered, political parties to inspect those candidate lists after the voter registration weekend. And therefore, the openness of candidate registration, that candidate registration process always closed after the voter registration weekend. And because of the nature of the South African polity and because of the demographics of the South African society, there are all sorts of people who would have come of age and been eligible to vote since the last election and the last process for registration, and they would therefore be categorically excluded. So in following the Constitutional Court's order, the IEC actually stuck to its timetable and changed the timetable only in terms of the amount of time it would take up for them to actually run an election on the 1st of November. And I always wondered what the point of the DA challenge was, because that process is agreed to in Parliament at the multi-party forum. And so it struck me as much more of a rhetorical sort of, shall we say, attempt to show that the DA is not negligible, because they have a very good record on challenging in the courts in 2012 to 2016 period. The other thing that I thought was that it laid the possibility that they could then, on their own, argue later on when they challenged at various points, particular electoral results. The judges may not be on their side, and we've seen this with Helen Zille's first tweet before the Constitutional Court came back, suggesting that the ANC's backing down from their challenge indicated that somehow the judiciary had been compromised. And then my concern around this is that, this kind of populist politics only weakens the very foundations of the society we live in, because it suggests greater distrust for cynical reasons when there is no such evidence for that distrust.
Now, talking about the ANC, they can't pay the staff, the cash flow issues, couldn't get the candidates list in time when the other parties managed to do so. Their own internal deadlines, they were not able seemingly to meet them. There's a degree of chaos, but simultaneously, the Ipsos survey telling us that whilst they are likely to drop below 50%, they are still likely from all the parties to get the most votes. What do you make of that? How do you analyze that? Is there still a degree of loyalty, blind loyalty, that will be shown to the ANC?
My position has never been that voters are blindly loyal to any particular party. When they vote for a particular party or they fail to turn out to vote, it often speaks to their reading of those other options. So those who don't turn out to vote often, even though they're registered, may be indicating that none of the parties appeal to them. When people vote for the ANC, it's also a reflection on the opposition parties. This is not a party that's sunk into its current chaos over the last year. This has been a party that for at least the last 15 to 20 years has been in all sorts of chaos. Let's not forget that even at the time that Thabo Mbeki took over, the policy on HIV/AIDS and ARVs, all the way through the arms scandal, then through the Jacob Zuma fiasco with Thabo Mbeki's excision from the position of leadership, then through the corruption issues in the wake of Marikana, through the Gauteng Health Department Life Esidimeni scandal. And somehow opposition parties have still not been able to draw more people away from the ANC than they have. And this is partly because so many voters don't see much of a difference in those parties on all sorts of things that matter to them. And this is, I think, a crucial issue that opposition parties will have to look to. As internally riven and chaotic as the ANC has been and continues to be, as implicated as it is in maladministration and corruption, it isn't voters' stupidity that explains why people do not vote for the opposition. It is an indictment of those opposition parties that voters don't read them as substantially different from the governing party, despite all their flaws. That being said, the ANC must meet the deadline if it is to be taken seriously in the second half of this particular decade, because increasingly the majority of South Africans are younger than 35. Very soon, majority will not have any experience of legislated apartheid and will have only an experience of post-apartheid South Africa under ANC governance. And the appetite of those people to continue to support the African National Congress based on promises and lack of delivery as evidence, that's beginning to wane. The 2016 local government elections in urban areas showed that the ANC is vulnerable. The 2021 local government elections may demonstrate how much of that has been, shall we say, has grown, the distrust in the ANC has grown, when we find those election results in early November. And again, one can only take the voters at their word and begin to interpret what those, acts of voting for, not voting for, or spoiling their ballots will mean. And the turnout rate is going to be very crucial. We know that local government elections often have much lower turnout than national elections. But what that turnout will be in spaces like Johannesburg, the economic heart of the country, Tshwane, the capital of the country, and in KwaZulu-Natal specifically will be crucial, because we've already had political and election violence when it came to registering and when it came to sorting out branch issues for the governing party. So the woes for the ANC are far from over, and it may actually be the beginning of a very spectacular down spiral if they can't stem the internal chaos that's not just at the top 6 level with their fight with their Secretary General, but actually at almost every branch level, as we've heard from various people across the country.
Talking about the other political parties and how voters look at them to see if they offer anything different in comparison to the ANC. During the course of this week, there was an article talking about how if you do a Google search in regards to DA, Helen Zille features more prominently than John Steenhuisen. And then there's been a lot of talk as to, to what extent the DA would lose votes as a result of the departure of Mmusi Maimane. How do you currently see John Steenhuisen? Does he have a grip on the party? Is he still overshadowed by Helen Zille?
So I don't have the sense that the party has that kind of personality cult, shall we say, that people tend to think of the DA and relate it only to a particular figure. The Democratic Alliance's various positions is often what people take issue with. And so on social media platforms and in casual conversations, people might object to what individual party members are doing. But it's often the vacillation that people have concerns about, the ways in which the party treats people who are considered to be not of the classical liberal old DP mold of the party. And as you point out, in the wake of the Mmusi Maimane treatment and of the results of the 2019 national elections, there certainly seems to be a shift in who supports the party, and the sort of people who had shifted their support to the Freedom Front. Plus, they're very unlikely, I think, to return to the Democratic Alliance. And then there are people who have shifted to good under Patricia de Lille because of the fallout between the DA and Patricia de Lille. And then there are people who would have been supporters of Mmusi Maimane and various other younger Black figures inside the party who would have been really, I think, alienated from the party's position by statements made during that transition around Mmusi Maimane's exit from the party by figures like Helen Zille and subsequently by John Steenhuisen. But there's also, I think, real concern around the ways in which the DA as a party has spoken through the lockdown period, through the pandemic, about issues affecting the pandemic and affecting most of us. And the positions that often sound very populist and often sound like they do not come from groundswell South African politics, but seem to be talking points in particularly right-wing North American politics around issues of libertarianism and freedom of individuality, and not really speaking to people's everyday realities that the party might have to address. Because again, their recent really vacillating position on vaccination echoes their vacillating position 5 to 6 years ago on broad-based Black economic empowerment and affirmative action. This kind of, we want individual choice for people. But actually, in a public health pandemic, it's much less about individual choice and much more about the public health. And that logic, that concern, that they seem to have a logical gap there, speaks to populist politics to appeal to a very small minoritarian, libertarian, free choice over everything else approach to life. That is actually also not even classical liberalism, because again, the way that the needs of the many have to, one hates to invoke Mr. Spock, have to outweigh the needs of the one. Otherwise, this is a society of anomie and atomization that is likely to implode into total chaos and possibly non-existence. Again, as a species, our history is not one of only individual special achievement. Our history as a species, the reason we have survived for as long as we have, is principally because of cooperation and group survival. And here is one of our first major tests in this century, this millennium, of whether we can stick together and survive together, or whether we choose individualist approaches to public health matters, which then could end up wiping us out as a species.
What are your thoughts on the prospects of the EFF in the upcoming elections? We had the whole fiasco with Malema and KZN and being prevented, from the registration process and that kind of thing. There has been a theory that the pandemic has been very unkind to them, that the kind of space that they usually enjoyed to keep themselves alive, especially in the media, was significantly compromised as a result of the pandemic.
So again, I think the EFF, like other political parties, have a very tough time to do the old 20th century style mass rallies and public performances during a pandemic. But that's the 21st century. The EFF is, much more, difficult. They find this much more difficult because they're not in government anywhere in the country. The Democratic Alliance can, trump about their Western Cape and City of Cape Town government achievements, and the ANC can do similar things for the places in the rest of the country where they imagine they have strong performances. The trouble with the EFF is that the kind of oppositional politics that they have practiced, which worked very well for them, and it was very successful in the 2014 to 2019 period, really relied on being in opposition and being in public opposition and calling upon young people. My sense is that their relationship with Jacob Zuma may damage them in all sorts of sectors. And I think that is an attempt to take ANC voters who are disaffected with the Ramaphosa years and want to return to the Jacob Zuma years to somehow gravitate towards the economic freedom fighters. Whether or not this actually happens is going to be tested in November. I don't have the pessimism that any particular political party is doing worse at managing pandemic-era electioneering. I think all South African organizations are finding it challenging to adapt to this new phase. Many people use the phrase they want to go back to normal. There is no going back. This is what we sit with for the rest of this decade at least, and possibly the century. The scientists have warned us for 20 years that we need to adapt to, among other things, the climate catastrophe and its consequences. This particular pandemic doesn't come out of the climate catastrophe, but it gives us a foretaste of the kinds of things we can look forward to and will have to adapt to. And our organizations, I think, are very poorly equipped to deal with this. And political parties in South Africa very much are very poorly positioned to change the way in which they do politicking, never mind the way in which they do electioneering. I recently see people still want to do door-to-door visits. This is a pandemic. Those door-to-door visits can be highly, highly dangerous because we don't know how many people are vaccinated and whether the people who are going to go door-to-door will in fact be vaccinated. And we don't know what new variants are likely to develop. And so we need to be very, very concerned around how people want to go back to a 20th century way of being that could wipe us out in this 21st century reality. And political parties have to adapt on the foot quicker.
Action SA, what's your take? There are those who say that they registered only to contest in certain municipalities or metros, and that's a reflection of the fact that they're not likely to make a big impact. They're going to be very regional. Others are saying that they are realistic. Yes, Herman Mashaba was talking big, but it's good that they're being realistic ahead of the elections.
So that is a smarter move. If we go back to the history of the NFP, this is how the NFP became a significant force in KwaZulu-Natal politics. They stuck to local politics, local candidates, local issues. And they really started falling apart when they tried too quickly, too soon, and too ambitiously launch themselves into national politics. It may be important for Action SA to launch themselves in particular wards and begin to build up a record of whatever it is that they intend to do. The concern that I think have as an observer of Action SA is that some of the issues that they raise are about national policy and are, implicated in our understanding of living in a constitutional democracy. Much of what I hear is actually xenophobic rhetoric. It's rhetoric against foreigners, against strangers. It asks of us to be parochial. And I think the challenge for us in this century is that parochialism is not going to resolve the crises that come our way. We have to begin to think far more proactively and creatively, and our political parties and organizations have to do this as well. Think proactively and creatively around cooperative agreements and how we all have to live together and survive together, because this is one blue marble spinning out in a very uninteresting part of the larger galaxy in a very massive universe. This idea that South Africans can somehow build walls to keep strangers out, and that they can somehow repel people who want to move here and somehow maintain a lawful society that is observant of human rights, and at the same time practice this ejection of people that they find inconvenient. This is not going to work. And the demonization of strangers echoes very much, tragically, the demonization of people on the inside of strangers that colonialism and apartheid bequeathed us. And so the multiple ironies of Action SA is that it seems to be a kind of right-wing populist approach that I don't think in the end will have positive effects, even though it may speak to people's insecurities and uncertainties in the short term. Because once the Action SA gets into those wards, gets those positions on legislatures, it's going to have to do some serious horse trading and may find itself accused, if that rhetoric continues and continues to be held in legislative spaces, may find itself challenged judicially by people who find their conduct inflammatory and their statements quite dangerous. And we need to be very careful in a society like South Africa that we don't practice the politics of division and not learn from societies that have done so and have ended up in the kinds of situations that we see in the United States, the United Kingdom for wealthy societies, in Brazil for societies challenged by old divisions, or the communitarian politics of violence and division that we've seen across parts of India. This is not a route that we can follow with productive outcomes. What we're likely to see is all the tragedies that have played out across the African continent that many people in Africa have warned South Africa against since 2008.
Will the IEC be ready, considering that it seemed like they were expecting the postponement until February next year? And what's your take on voter turnout? Will the recent rioting and looting motivate people to come and try and make a difference via the ballot? Or is the state of the big political parties a cause of disillusionment amongst the voters?
So there is no doubt that we will have a very challenging election period ahead of us, both in terms of campaigning and on the day itself. We cannot have the situation that we saw over the weekend repeat itself. And here, the fact that our security, shall we say, institutions, the organizations of state security and policing have been shown up to be much weaker than we imagined they should be during June and July, that has to really be buffed up, that actually the state is responsible for the safety of all its citizens. People cannot be intimidated to stay away from polls by organizations or by groups of people who are disaffected with the system. And that's crucial. The second issue that has to happen is that the IEC simply has to be ready. The timetable that they outlined makes it possible. The choice that the ball is now in the Court of Government to fund it. So Parliament has to make sure that Treasury allows the IEC to do its job. It's a very truncated timetable, but that means volunteers and people have to be trained in order to run the election appropriately. Additional training has to be provided to manage social distancing in the queues. So there is no choice. This is something that has to happen. And as the Constitutional Court ruled, if the election turns out not to be fair and fair in various spaces, then that has to be done. The challenges to those election processes and outcomes have to happen by the political parties and their representatives who are present in those polling stations after the fact. If in the wake of the election it's found that largely widespread interference or widespread unfreedom of running a poll happened, we will have to revisit that as a society. This idea that we should have postponed it preemptively, I think, was never going to stand up, precisely because that asked of the Constitutional Court to change the Constitution, and that would have done away with the separation of powers, which would have put a very, very risky precedent on the books. And in emergency periods, you have to do emergency thinking, but you shouldn't suspend your institutions from functioning the way they do, because that sets up a different set of problems.
Finally, then, Angelo, Joburg loses very tragically its second mayor in as many months. What is the ANC likely to do? Are we going to have like an acting mayor because it's a short period to the elections? And could this compromise the ANC's chances of retaining the Joburg Metro?
So the death of the mayor was a tragedy that the ANC will have to deal with in terms of his role inside the party. The second issue is that this is a city that's running in a very specific way during an emergency time, and it does need municipal leadership. And there, I think it's crucial that an acting mayor be appointed by the legislature ASAP. And it cannot be that simply because there's a month left, we can't have this. There's still going to be a transition period. We cannot have no government. Particularly because public service is so weakened by maladministration, corruption, and partly by party deployment through cadre deployment. And so the replacement of the mayor with an acting mayor is absolutely essential. And whether they choose to make that the deputy mayor is their issue. And for the party itself, it really will have to think very carefully about who they replace him with in their party structures, because of the role that he played in finance and in trying to re-regulate finance and finance in the municipality. And that's crucial if we're going to have an end to corruption in sight rather than a return to the problems that we've had before.
Angelo Fick, it's always fascinating talking to you on a variety of issues. We thank you for your time once again.
Shukran.
And to the viewers, until next week, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.